John Heritage, Senior Lecturer in Microbiology at the University of Leeds. I thought today I'd like to share some thoughts about cholera and take you from there into other waterborne diseases. Water is essential for the maintenance of all forms of life. Leonardo da Vinci recognised water as the driver of nature. It also acts as the vector for many diseases caused by bacteria, viruses, protozoa and even worms. For water to be regarded as potable, that is, safe and of a fit quality for drinking, it must be free from such pathogens. Furthermore, it mustn't contain any noxious substances, such as chemical hazards including pesticides, insecticides or herbicides, and artificial fertilizers and also heavy metal ions. Potable water should also not have an unpleasant odour or taste. Cholera provides an example of fatal infections spread by water. The study of this disease contributed very significantly to our understanding of the epidemiology of disease, the branch of medicine that studies diseases prevalent amongst communities at particular times. We shall explore cholera in detail, but we'll also consider other significant waterborne infections and then examine how we determine whether water is microbiologically safe to drink. Among the bacterial infections that are spread by water are cholera, dysentery and the enteric fevers. Hepatitis A and poliovirus infections after consumption of contaminated water are virus infections. Amoebic dysentery is caused by the protozoan Entamoeba histolytica, contaminated water, or by eating fresh fruit, salad or vegetables that have been washed in contaminated water. Other protist diseases, such as those caused by Giardia intestinalis, also known as Giardia lamblia, Balantidium coli, and Cryptosporidium species, are spread in a similar fashion. Schistosomiasis, also known as Bilharzia, is a waterborne infestation caused by worms of the genus Schistosoma, although this will not be considered further in this presentation. So cholera. Cholera is a disease that has been known since ancient times. It was confined to the Indian subcontinent, but between 1817 and 1923 there were 6 pandemics in which classical cholera spread from its original home across the globe. In the period from 1817 to 1823, Asia was affected by the first pandemic. During the 1830s, the second pandemic occurred, affecting Asia, Europe and North America. This subsided to be replaced by the third pandemic, which spread across Asia, Europe and North America. This occurred from 1846 to 1862. The fourth pandemic started in 1865 and was a truly pandemic disease with a global spread that lasted for a decade. Then, in 1881, the fifth pandemic occurred, spreading across Asia and Europe. This ceased by 1896, but just 3 years later, the sixth pandemic began, again primarily affecting Asia and Europe. This ended in 1923. The pandemics of the past were caused by the classical serotype of Vibrio cholerae. This serotype causes the most severe form of the disease. Between 1960 and 1971, a seventh pandemic occurred, this being caused by the L. Tor strain of Vibrio cholerae, so named after the village in Sinai where it was first isolated. The L. Tor strain causes a milder form of cholera, associated with a lower rate of mortality than the disease caused by the classical strain of the bacterium. The L. Tor strain has now replaced the classical strain as the endemic strain around the world, except in parts of the Indian subcontinent. Serovar 0139 appeared in Bangladesh in 1932 and is currently confined to Southeast Asia. Cholera is now endemic in South America as well as in Asia. In the Indian subcontinent, cholera is most common along the pilgrim routes and is found particularly along the sacred rivers, the Ganges and the Brahmaputra, underlining the importance of water as the vector for infection. Evidence of these great pandemics survives today. Cholera graveyards can still be seen. One such graveyard exists outside the city walls at York, just opposite the railway station. 185 victims of the second pandemic are buried in this plot, continuing an ancient practice of burying the victims of infectious diseases beyond the boundaries of cities. The cholera graves in York are just a couple of hundred yards away from All Saints North Street Church. This is the church in which John Snow was baptised. The connection between cholera and water was made by the pioneering epidemiological studies of the anaesthetist John Snow in the early part of the 19th century in London. Even John Faraday was defeated by his attempts to clean up Father Thames. Snow observed that cholera cases were linked with people who obtained their drinking water from the pump located in Broad Street, Soho. People who drank beer were far less likely to get cholera than those people whose preferred drink was water drawn from the Broad Street pump. Snow argued that cholera resulted from consumption of something noxious found in the water drawn from the pump. To confirm his suspicions, he removed the handle from the pump, thus preventing access to the contaminated water supply. This action caused a dramatic reduction in the number of cholera victims, confirming Snow's hypothesis and saving many lives. His report was published in 1854. Nevertheless, Snow's ideas were not accepted by the medical profession of the day. His peers argued that although he had demonstrated that the pump was the cause of the illness, the mechanism by which people became ill eluded him. If it was a poison that made people ill, why was this not infinitely diluted by the water of the Thames? Snow's work was dismissed at the time of publication. It was only when the germ theory of disease became established that the significance of Snow's work was recognised. He's now hailed as the founding father of epidemiology. This was not the first time that important epidemiological work was ignored. At about the same time that Snow was conducting studies on the waterborne spread of cholera, Ignaz Semmelweis was working on the cause of Puerperal Fever, also known as childbed fever. This was killing women in the lying-in wards of the Vienna General Hospital, the Allgemeines Krankenhaus der Stadt Wien. Puerperal fever is a septicemic illness, or blood poisoning, that affects recently delivered mothers, and it has happened since time immemorial. It is most commonly the result of infection with Streptococcus pyogenes. There were 2 obstetric clinics in Vienna at the time that Semmelweis was working. The chances of a woman dying from puerperal fever were significantly higher in the first clinic than in the second. What was puzzling was that in the first clinic, women had supposedly greater care, with their labours attended by medical staff. Women in the second clinic were only attended by midwives. Because of the bad reputation of the first clinic, women would beg not to be admitted, and on the days that the first clinic admitted women, some preferred to give birth in the streets rather than be admitted to the first clinic and thus risk dying of puerperal fever. It would be expected that the women who gave birth on the streets would be just as likely to suffer fatal infection as those admitted to hospital to give birth. This was not so. It was safer for women to be delivered in the street than it was in hospital. Semmelweis compared all the practices in the 2 clinics, even looking into the variations in religious practices. He was a Jew working in a predominantly Christian environment. The only difference was that the medical personnel. Medical students were taught obstetrics in the first clinic, midwives only were employed and trained on the second clinic. The death of a colleague provided insight into the problem. His colleague died from septicemia following an accidental inoculation of cadaveric material, bits of dead body, that occurred during a post-mortem examination. Medical students learn anatomy through dissection, and Semmelweis argued that cadaveric material would be carried on their hands. If he instituted a rigorous hand-washing routine before attending to the delivery of women, this source of puerperal fever should be eliminated. In 1847, he introduced the practice of hand-washing using a solution of calcium hypochlorite. This had the immediate effect of reducing the incidence of puerperal fever in the first clinic from a high of about 30% to a level of 1 to 2%, comparable to the incidence seen in the second clinic, and of street births. His employment was terminated on March the 20th, 1849. Calcium hypochlorite was chosen because it was found to be the most effective agent in removing the putrid smell of cadaverous material from the hands of volunteers. Hypochlorites are widely used these days in bleaches. Indeed, chlorine is used in water treatment. Nevertheless, despite his dramatic demonstration, Semmelweis was ridiculed. Enforced hand-washing was considered unnecessary, and he was even forced out of his post. This caused bitter disappointment, which eventually caused a mental breakdown. In 1865, he was committed to an asylum where soon after his admission he developed blood poisoning and died, probably from the wounds inflicted upon him during the beatings in the asylum. The irony of his death is that the blood poisoning from which he suffered was very similar to the puerperal fever that he fought so hard to control.